Hey everyone, welcome to Rebekah's Reading Corner. This is the first video that I'll be posting on this channel, and I'm so glad that you're here to see it. Hopefully, I'll be able to do a lot of fun things with this channel, but for now, I'm going to start with doing some book reviews. Today I'll be talking about the 2014 sci-fi novel, Annihilation. So I'll be starting out with some spoiler-free thoughts in case you want to read it, but you don't want anything spoiled. And then I'll go into the characters, the plots, and the themes, and then finishing up with a little bit of a comparison to the 2018 movie adaptation of the same name. It's a little bit of a synopsis. This book is about this place called Area X, which is like this crazy, unknown place that was ruined by nuclear warfare, and now nature has reclaimed it, but everything's a little weird. And then this organization called the Southern Reach sends out people on expeditions to explore and kind of get scientific data on the place, but they pretty much all end in tragedy, like mass suicide or murdering each other and such. And that all happens before the events of the book. In this book, it focuses on the 12th expedition, which is a group of 4 women made up of an anthropologist, a psychologist, a surveyor, and a biologist. And the biologist is the protagonist and narrator of the book, and it follows their journey and expedition through Area X. So my initial thoughts on the book, initially it was a little hard to read. I used to love science fiction, but I hadn't read a science fiction book in a long time, and I really wanted to get back into it, so I picked this up. And the narrator, she's a biologist, so she has a really scientific way of thinking and speaking, and I'm more of a creative brain person, so it was a little hard to follow at first, but as it went along, it got easier, and I definitely got more invested in the story, and I thought it was really interesting and fascinating, this world that the author has created, and all these creatures and basically unknown horrors beyond human comprehension at points. But the way that it's described, I think having this scientific viewpoint works really well for the story that it's telling, and even though the story is really weird and it left me with a lot of questions instead of answers, but it is the first book in the series, and I plan on reading the other 2, so hopefully they have some explanations to things that were left unanswered in this first book. Alright, now we're going to be getting into a bit of spoiler territory. So starting with the characters, there's the 4 main women that the expedition follows, and so we'll mostly just focus on those characters. Starting with the anthropologist, we don't really know a whole lot about her, just that she used to be an architect, and the biologist, the narrator, doesn't really think that she's very mentally tough and isn't really quite fit for an expedition of this kind. We don't really get to learn a whole lot about her because she dies pretty much right away, and that's on the first night of their expedition, I believe. So we don't really get time to know the character. She kind of just serves as a plot device or a conflict starter between the other characters, so there's not a whole lot to say on her character. Next we have the psychologist, who's like the leader of the group. She was present during the initial interviews for the other women during their recruitment stage, and right away the biologist doesn't like her. She seems sneaky and manipulative and controlling, and she uses hypnosis throughout the book to control the other members of the expedition. She says it's to keep them calm so they don't freak out when they face things in Area X, but it's quickly revealed that that's not totally true, and we start to wonder what exactly she's doing to the other members' minds while they're under hypnosis. And as the book progresses, it slowly reveals like more and more of her little cheat codes, hypnotic inducing words that she says and what they're supposed to do to the different people. She acts in ways that could be interpreted to either be very selfish or could be interpreted to be she takes her job very seriously and is willing to do whatever it takes to complete her mission and do her work, because her actions negatively impact the 3 other women in the group. Is starting with the anthropologist. The anthropologist dies because the psychologist uses hypnosis, convinces her to do something, and leads her into danger. A little bit later in the book, she abandons the remaining members of the crew and just walks off to this lighthouse that's in Area X and just leaves the other 2 there. And I think it's definitely a selfish reason. Like, she wasn't considering the other women when making that decision. Like, she was just caring about herself, what she needed to do, because we see later that she's starting to lose her mind a little bit and is like very afraid after the biologist discovers that the hypnosis isn't quite what she was being told. You know, there's a lot of tension that builds up, and this makes the psychologist react out of fear, out of self-preservation, to just get away as fast as possible. And she really kind of serves as like the main human antagonist of the book. She's definitely the at least the instigator of a lot of the conflict in the story. In general, I think she was a pretty interesting character for the most part. We don't really know a whole lot about the motivations that she had, because we don't know a lot about her personally. And that's one thing that the book really makes important note of, that the characters make sure that they don't know each other's names, that they don't know anything about their personal lives, and they just strictly professional. So they only talk about Area X, about their expedition and their work, and the organization that they are working for. They don't really talk much about their lives outside of that. We don't really know anything about the psychologist's background, or like the anthropologist or the surveyor. We don't know much about them. So it's kind of hard to determine their motivations. But I think in general that the psychologist really just seems like she's there for herself, to protect herself, to get her job done, and it doesn't really matter much to her what happens to the others in the group. Moving on, we have the surveyor, who is like the military expert of the group, and she's very abrasive and distrusting of everyone, which is totally fair in Area X because that place is crazy. It just really sets up the failure of this group. You have the psychologist who is lying to everyone, and the surveyor who's distrusting of everyone, and that creates an already tense dynamic between all the women in the group because of that level of distrust. And the surveyor is not willing to listen to the biologist very much. Like, when the biologist reveals that the psychologist has been lying and is manipulating them through this hypnosis, the surveyor kind of doesn't believe the biologist, or at least really doesn't want to believe the biologist. It leads to the surveyor kind of has to pick sides, like which woman is she going to believe, and she kind of sides more with the psychologist throughout the book, but the surveyor thinks that the biologist is just seeing things, is going crazy, being manipulated by Area X and the forces that are in there. So she doesn't really want to believe what the biologist is saying. And it leads to an interesting dynamic of, like, who is telling the truth? What is right? What is wrong? Who can we trust in this narrative? Overall, I would say the surveyor was kind of just a flat character, didn't have a lot of development, but you know, she served her purpose as the military, guns a-blazing type in this environment. And finally, we have our protagonist, the biologist. So the biologist is, I would say, obsessive and like very passionate about biology, and that plays a major role in her experiences in Area X because it's a place where nature has taken over and, you know, everything's sort of alive, but it really ties her like to this place, like her, and her obsession only grows as the book progresses, and we can kind of attribute it to maybe the spores that she inhaled are making her like more connected to the place as time goes on, making her grow fonder of the crazy wild that's going on out there. But from the beginning, she kind of is already headed in that direction. Like, regardless of the influences of the spores, going into it, she's kind of already obsessed, and she like kind of over the course of the story falls in love with Area X to the point where by the end she's so interwoven into this environment that she doesn't want to leave. She kind of feels as if she's now part of the ecosystem there. It was interesting to read from her perspective, because, you know, at first you're like, okay, scientific and exploring and focused on the nature of the environment, and as it goes on, you start to question how reliable is this narrator, you know? Is she telling the truth? Is she actually seeing reality for what it is, or is she seeing something that's not really there? Is she the crazy one, or are the other characters the crazy ones? You know, we don't really know. We kind of know her motivations for going into Area X in the first place. In a previous expedition, her husband went to Area X, And when he came back, he wasn't himself. He was strange and like empty of his like personality and memories. And then he died very soon after of cancer. Like everyone in that expedition came back the same and ended up the same. So she wants to go to Area X to kind of figure out what happened to her husband. She begins the story obsessed and ends the story even more obsessed and almost like absorbed into Area X. But personally, I was a little frustrated with her change over the course of the story and her choice to stay in Area X, but I think her character is a fascinating one to explore. You know, there's a lot you can do with obsession in a character and how it really drives them to do things that we would consider like insane, but to them it's just like the right thing to do, the logical path to follow. It's interesting to see how blurred the lines are between where her logical thought process is and maybe what Area X is influencing in her thought process. Alright, now diving into the plot of the book, it starts out with the women heading off on their journey and crossing the border between civilization and Area X. And we don't really know what happened to them during that time because the psychologist had hypnotized them. So they were like unconscious during their travels across. They set up in their base camp, and then there's this, the biologist calls it a tower, but the other women call it a tunnel because it's like a circular staircase that just kind of goes down into the ground. There are words written on the wall and like this organism, plant-like, fungi-like substance, but they don't know who's writing the words and what they mean. They're very cryptic and like biblical sounding. And then the biologist inhales the spores from those words, and then that kind of kicks off the events. The psychologist then hypnotizes the anthropologist that night to go back down in the tunnel, and the anthropologist dies because they come in contact with a creature. And then when she comes back up the next morning, she tells the other two that the anthropologist has simply decided to leave and go home. But the biologist doesn't trust this and tries to convince the surveyor that something's not right. But then they go back down into the tower and find the anthropologist's body. But then when they come back up after exploring, then they realize that the psychologist is gone. And the psychologist went to the lighthouse, which is kind of like sort of been a base for previous expeditions to go to. And one of the expeditions had a split between the groups that then like fought each other and like killed everyone. So it was kind of also like a war zone. But this is the point where the biologist and the surveyor are arguing about whether to keep exploring or go home. And the biologist somehow convinces the surveyor that she should wait there at camp while the biologist goes to the lighthouse to find the psychologist. So the biologist goes through Area X off to the lighthouse, and there's a lot of weird creatures and things that are like, they're not human, but there are humanistic qualities. Like she comes across a bunch of moss grown in the shape of people and then she comes across some dolphins swimming by with like human eyes. But you kind of get the vibe throughout the book that the people that have gone on these expeditions have become the creatures there, or like part of the ecosystem, just because there are so many moments where things are hinted at to have a human-like quality, or outright have the narrator find out bits of a person is within something else. The biologist goes to the lighthouse, finds a whole bunch of journals from previous expeditions, and too many to have just been 11 expeditions. So this is the moment where she realizes the organization is really lying to everyone about what they're doing and how many people they've sent out there. And this really, like, even more cements the feeling that the narrator is now on the side of Area X. She's no longer on the side of humanity, and we can see this through her interactions with the psychologist at the lighthouse. The psychologist had jumped from the top in like a fit of hysteria because the biologist was glowing, and she was like afraid and was like, "You're not a human anymore." And the biologist was like, "I don't know what you're talking about. Of course I'm human." And the psychologist reveals a lot of information about how the organization is lying, how the border's expanding, how this Area X may just end all of humanity if it's not stopped. And then the psychologist dies. So then the biologist has no choice but to return to base camp, where the surveyor sees her coming, says basically the same thing, that you're glowing, you're not human anymore, what are you? And this moment is kind of the moment that I knew that the biologist was like lost to Area X, because the environment kind of helps her, like keens her senses and stuff, and she kills the surveyor, basically cementing her place in this environment. She goes back down into the tower, and this is where it gets like even more weird and trippy, because she goes down and she sees the crawler, which is what she has dubbed the creature writing the words on the walls. And it's this like horror beyond human comprehension. It's constantly changing its physical appearance and shape, and the biologist like feels like she's like drowning, and she like manages somehow to pass through beyond the crawler and goes all the way down to the bottom of the stairs until she finds a door. And I was very curious about what is behind that door, but apparently the biologist was not, because then she decides to crawl back up the stairs and pass by the crawler again. And there's a whole lot more wild stuff that I didn't even cover, just because there's just so much content in here. Like, it's not a long book, but there's a lot of content as far as like the creatures in the area and all sorts of stuff that I didn't really dive into and that I can't really explain all that well, so you should just read it. But yeah, at the end, the biologist decides to stay in Area X. Personally, I didn't like the ending, but the ending fit the story. And so I think I can say that, and I don't like an ending while still acknowledging that it is a good ending for the story that it's telling. But yeah, overall, I really liked this book. I plan on reading the other two, and I'm excited to see where the rest of this sort of plot goes from here. So I'm just going to dive a little bit into the themes of the book. A big one is definitely like man versus nature, how we treat the environment and how it will treat us back in return. The area has been destroyed with nuclear and like radioactive weapons, and has since transformed into this place of like horrifying beauty and nature, and the whole area is alive. Even the tower, we see the biologist realize that the tower is breathing. I think the biologist definitely gets sucked in to the beauty of this place, and it's very interesting, the world that is being portrayed here, because the biologist almost sees it as like an accomplice, a friend, and it's definitely an antagonist to all the other characters. So, it's a very interesting dynamic between how the characters treat the place and therefore how it responds to them. When we talk about sci-fi, we normally think of like outer space or like high-tech, futuristic stuff, but they even make a point of the characters don't have high technology. They have really old technology because nature has rejected it so much that it's a danger to bring anything modern or recent. And so it's interesting for a sci-fi novel to have like that almost otherworldly quality to it, but not have, the typical science fiction technology aspect. And I thought that was really interesting. Another sort of theme that the book touches on is this whole like what is really happening, like the concept of reality and like the truth, because the characters all lie, they don't trust each other. We have a sort of unreliable narrator. We don't know who is telling the truth, who's really seeing things for what they are. We don't even really know what's actually happening versus what maybe is a hallucination brought on by Area X. And so it's really fascinating. And honestly a little frustrating at times to try to pick out what is the truth of the matter, what is really happening here. And then really briefly, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between the book and the movie. So in the book, obviously the characters don't know each other's names, and that is part of the whole dynamic for the characters, and that they don't know each other personally. But in the movie, all of the characters, have names. They like know each other's names, and it kind of detracts from that sort of idea of isolation that the book really leans into. And it kind of loses that in the movie. And then the main differences I want to talk about kind of revolve around the ending and a little bit of the beginning. So, in the book, the 11th expedition, all of the members returned, like empty and ending up with cancer and stuff. But in the movie, it's just the biologist's husband that returns. Like, none of the other expedition crew members return. So I don't know why they made that change, because that change doesn't seem to make like a whole lot of sense to me personally. Then in the end, they changed the ending of it and have her kind of return to civilization. I don't know. Like I said, I didn't like that she stayed in Area X at the end, but it just seems like a pointless change to take like the final decision of the character and like totally reverse it. You know, like that was a big important idea, was that she fell in love with this place and wanted to stay there. And the movie just kind of rips all the meaning away from the ending. And like detracts, I think, from what the author is saying in the book. I mean, I know he had a lot of influence in the movie, or at least I think he did. But it just kind of seems pointless, the way that they changed the ending. Like, if they had to change it, there were other ways that they could have done it that didn't like totally opposite what the book was going for. Overall, those are my thoughts on the book. I know I probably rambled a little, so if you're still here at the end, thank you for taking the time to listen to me talk about this book. I definitely recommend that you read this. It's a great option if you really like sci-fi, or maybe if you want to get into sci-fi. Just give it a try. I'm sure it's at libraries somewhere. It's been out for a while. But yeah, I hope you read it and enjoy. Be sure to leave your thoughts on the book in the comments, and I'll catch you later.